What if the most repeated piece of cooking advice on the planet is something almost nobody has ever actually tested? You've heard it 1,000 times. Sear the steak first, get that crust, lock in the juices. Every cooking show, every grandmother, every steakhouse menu description repeats some version of the same idea, that a hard sear creates a seal, a kind of edible shrink wrap, trapping moisture inside while the rest of the meat cooks. It feels true. The steak hisses, steam rises. Something is clearly happening on that surface. And when you cut into a perfectly seared ribeye, it is juicy. So the story checks out, right? Except the story is almost 200 years old, and it was wrong from the very first sentence.
In 1847, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig published a theory about meat cookery that had nothing to do with experiment and everything to do with intuition. He proposed that searing meat at high heat first would harden the surface into a kind of protective shell, retarding the escape of internal juices for the rest of the cook. It sounded mechanical, almost engineering-like. A seal, a barrier. The idea spread through cookbooks for generations because it offered something most cooking advice doesn't: a clean, satisfying mental picture of cause and effect.
Here's the first reveal. Zoom into the muscle tissue itself, down to the fiber level, and the sealed shell idea falls apart immediately. Raw meat is roughly 70% water, most of it trapped inside long, thin muscle fibers, bundled together like a wet rope. There is no membrane forming, no waterproof skin growing across the surface when you sear. What's actually happening is that intense heat causes the proteins inside those fibers to denature, to unwind and tighten, almost exactly like wringing a wet towel. The fibers physically contract, and a contracting fiber doesn't hold water in. It squeezes water out.
That hiss you hear in the pan isn't the sound of a seal forming. It's the sound of juice hitting hot metal and instantly evaporating. Moisture actively leaving the meat while you watch. So, if the sealed crust idea is structurally impossible at the fiber level, how did a respected chemist get it so wrong? And how did the myth survive 150 years of professional kitchens repeating it?
This is the second reveal, and it's where things get genuinely interesting. Nobody seriously tested von Liebig's claim with controlled measurement until food scientist Harold McGee dug into it for his landmark book on kitchen science. And later, writer Kenji López-Alt ran it through repeatable side-by-side trials. The setup is almost embarrassingly simple. Take two pieces of the same cut, same starting weight. Sear one before finishing it, cook the other with no sear at all, same final internal temperature. Weigh both afterward. If the sealed crust theory were true, the seared piece should retain noticeably more moisture.
It doesn't. Across repeated tests, the seared and unseared pieces lose statistically the same amount of moisture. The crust changes nothing about how much water leaves the meat. It only changes what happens to the outside 2 or 3 millimeters of it. Which raises an obvious question. If searing isn't protecting the inside of your steak at all, why does a seared steak so often taste juicier than a boiled or steamed one cooked the same way?
Third reveal, and this is the one that actually explains the original confusion. Juiciness was never primarily a function of the crust. It's a function of 3 completely different variables that happen to get correlated with searing by accident. First, internal temperature. Meat cooked to a lower final temperature, rare to medium, simply hasn't had time to squeeze out as much liquid as something pushed to well done, regardless of whether it was seared. Second, fat content. Marbled fat melts and bastes the muscle fibers from the inside, which reads to your palate as juiciness, even when actual water content is dropping. Third, resting. Letting meat sit for several minutes after cooking lets the remaining liquid redistribute evenly through the fibers, instead of flooding out the moment you cut it. None of those 3 things require a crust. People just usually sear the same cuts they're cooking rare, with good marbling, and then let rest. So the crust got credit for a result it had almost nothing to do with.
So searing does nothing? That's the wrong conclusion too, and it's worth correcting before this turns into the opposite myth. Searing absolutely matters, just not for the reason anyone told you. High heat on the surface triggers the Maillard reaction, the same chemistry responsible for toasted bread and roasted coffee, where proteins and sugars rearrange into hundreds of new flavor compounds that simply don't exist in unseared meat. That's not a side effect. That's the entire point. You're not building a wall to keep something in. You're building flavor that was never there before the heat touched it. Which brings the whole thing back to that hiss in the pan. The sound that, for almost 2 centuries, people heard as a seal closing. It was never closing anything. It was the sound of one thing leaving: moisture, so that something else entirely could be created on the surface in its place.